The Russian forces made numerous advances on the eastern flank of the Slovyansk-Kramatorsk direction, gaining control over additional positions near the canal to the northwest of Soledar near Vasyukivka and within Siversk in the east, as well as to the south of Yempil in the direction of Dibrova and Ozerna. The Russians also managed to advance to the southwest of Novopavlivka, gaining control over some forest patches here northwest of Filia, and the Ukrainians managed to recapture Tichy as well as the farm area to the southwest of the town, where they've been launching some counterattacks along the Zaporizhia and Dnipropetrovsk region over the past few days. The Ukrainians have been launching counterattacks both in the direction of Novopavlivka, here to the southwest of Pokrovsk. They've also managed to recapture some positions here near Tichy, and they've been launching counterattacks north of Pulepole. At the same time, they've been launching counterattacks near Kubansk over the past few months, and before that in the Zaporizhia region near Stepnohirsk. The Ukrainians are launching counterattacks in specified areas. It is typically areas where the Russians are making the most gains, the areas where the defenses are most advantageous and most important, like the Stepnohirsk direction, which are areas that are tactically important for the Ukrainians to hold on to. And then the interesting part is the Kubansk direction, because Kubansk in and of itself is not as important as what is being dedicated to it of resources. Both the Ukrainian forces east of the Oskar River line and their forces counterattacking in the direction of Kubansk itself, it is a very large amount of resources that is being expended for such operations. This raises the question as to why they are doing so. Now, the interesting part is that the Russian soldiers working in the Kupiansk direction, they say that it was not very difficult for them to advance all the way until it became the center of attention. And if we see over the past few days, the Ukrainians' counterattacks have significantly increased at the start of this month, the very end of last month. And at the same period of time, we can see numerous times where Putin had talked about Kupiansk. So I believe what we're seeing is that Putin is bringing attention to the city, talking about how they're having a major victory in the area, how they're succeeding. They'll soon capture all of Kupiansk. They will encircle 15 battalions of Ukrainian soldiers, a vast amount of resources, a vast amount of soldiers that is being dedicated to this battle, and the Russians are winning. Then the Ukrainians are responding to it by turning the situation around and making it more in their favor. And from that, we can see that the Ukrainians here are really aiming at a morale hit for the Russians and discrediting the Russians and Putin. By reversing the situation, they're discrediting Putin and hitting the morale of the Russians. But the resources being used for this really sets into question the benefits versus the cost in this scenario. Because taking a look at the fortifications in the area through the fortifications map, the Russians will not be able to advance much further than they currently are before they hit these defensive lines, which are difficult to breach through. Even to the south of Kupiansk, there are numerous fortifications and trenches that are difficult to pass through. The Russians managed to pass through the western flank, but they never captured the fortifications on the eastern flank. This led to the Ukrainians to quickly recapture these positions and counterattack in the direction of Kupiansk. So it is evident that the Russians will have a difficult time pushing south of Kupiansk and west of Kupiansk due to the fortifications the Ukrainians have prepared. And if they have such a significant concentration of forces east of the Oskar River line, a withdrawal to this defensive line will allow them to fully man it and be able to properly defend it. This means it is tactically speaking, militarily speaking, not sensible for Ukraine to not withdraw from these positions, which aren't really that significant tactically and strategically, because in the end, the Russians will not be able to properly supply Kupiansk as long as the Ukrainians keep striking the bridges across the Oskar River line. This will limit the Russian offensive capabilities in the area, but instead redirecting their forces to the Vovchansk direction to prevent a Russian breakthrough in the area, to redirect their forces along the border area, to prevent the Russians from properly establishing themselves on the western bank of the Oskar River line is much more important than holding their positions on the eastern bank, because the eastern bank holdings are simply for offensive operations, not defensive operations. So, militarily speaking, for defensive operations, what makes the most sense is pulling back to the western bank of the Usk river line and establishing a defensive line along the river line, pushing the Russians back across, or even preventing them from making the crossing in the first place. But instead, the Ukrainians opted in for allowing the Russians to advance, holding their positions on the eastern bank of the river line. Putin starts speaking about the success in the area. They redirect forces and counterattack these positions to regain control over the city at a heavy cost. Now, taking a look at the developments across the front line, the Ukrainians managed to recapture Tychy, as we see with this geolocated footage, which confirms their Ukrainian recapture of it with the geolocation on the western and eastern outskirts of the town. The Ukrainians managed to recapture it through the Vovcha river line, where they're looking to put pressure on the Russian positions north of the defensive line, cutting off the supply lines to the Russian forces operating near Huliaipole. To the northeast of this, Russians captured the forest patch areas here northwest of Filia, continuing defensive operations along the Solona river line, where they're looking to gain full control over Novopavlivka. To establish full control, they need a proper bridgehead across the Solona river line, gaining control over the northern parts and the western parts, cutting off the connection to Ivanivka, and generally continuing their positional fighting along the river line itself, both the Vovcha and Solina river lines. To the northeast of this, the Russians made numerous advances on the eastern flank of the canal, but they also managed to gain control over some fortifications to the west of Oryhovo-Vasilivka and the forest patches to the south of the town. The majority of the town is now in the grey zone, as both Russian and Ukrainian soldiers are present within it. The Russians have also pushed through to threaten the fortifications on the northern flank of Oryhovo-Vasilivka. The objective of the Russians is to gain control of the fortifications on the outskirts of Minkivka, and then to bypass the fortifications here along the highway by pushing through along Minkivka itself onto the fortifications along the highway and encircle the Ukrainian forces along these fortifications along the E40 highway. To the northeast of this, the Russians also managed to gain control of the fortifications in between Vasyukivka and Peseno, gaining control over the road leading from Vasyukivka to Peseno. With this, the Russians have control over the road between Fedorivka and Peseno to the east, Vasyukivka and Peseno to the south, and the town itself is contested, again with the Russian and Ukrainian forces both being present within the town. Russians are here looking to gain control of it and align the front line with the forest patches to the south of it, before pushing on towards Bondarne and Khomivka, where they continue offensive operations in the direction of the canal further west. To the northeast, the Russians managed to secure a significant portion of the apartment complex area in the eastern parts of the town, and pushing the Ukrainians out from it. With the loss of the apartment complex area, what remains of it is now in the grey zone, and therefore the Ukrainians were forced to withdraw from the apartment complex area towards the Bakhmutovka river, where they're now working on crossing back over onto the western bank of the river line, establishing themselves in the positions there, while what remains on the eastern bank of the river line is contested as Russian forces are pushing from the southern and eastern flanks. If Russians are able to gain full control of the eastern bank of the railway line as well as the river line, the Russians will be able to connect their forces from the north, east and south, strengthening defensive operations on the northern flank of Siversk towards the fortifications on the western flank of the town. While the capture of the town itself and the fortifications to the west of it will allow the Russians to connect with the forces on the Siversk-Donetsk river line, as well as to the southwest to flank the fortifications and around Sviatopokrovsk and Resnikivka. Gaining control of these fortifications will cover the southern flank of Siversk and allow them to push further in the direction of the canal, further alongside it, with Russians launching offensive operations generally on the eastern bank of the canal, with the objective of gaining control over everything to the east of it, establishing a front line alongside it. To the north of this, the Russians managed to gain a foothold within Ozerna, the northern outskirts of the town, gain full control over the forest patches on the side of it, and are fighting alongside the fortifications and forest patches in between Dibrova and Ozerna, where the Russians are fighting on the outskirts of both of these settlements and over the fortifications in between them. The Russians are here working on gaining full control over Dibrova and Ozerna, which will allow them to then push in the direction of the final settlements along the southern flank of Liman to cut off the highway connection and any river crossings the Ukrainians have available in the area, and then to make their own crossings in the direction of Zakitne and other positions here alongside the Siversk-Donetsk river line, connecting with the forces south of the river line operating near Platonivka, Zhonivka, the fortifications, and Siversk itself. Now, there is an interesting parallel reality that is happening on the eastern flank and northern flank of Kościantinivka. The Russian Ministry of Defense claims that the Russians have captured Novomarkove and Markove and then have pushed from Mayske to gain control over Klinove and Besemyane. This is a very interesting development because if we take a look at the fortifications map, we can see here in the eastern flank of Kashantinivka and northern flank of the city, the Russians have already captured Mayske. They've captured it for a while. There has been claims of Markova and Markova being captured by the Russians for a long time. However, no geolocated footage confirms this, and no reputable source has corroborated on it either. The sources I follow have connections with the 98th Air Assault Division. However, they have been rotated out from Chesev Yar quite a while ago, and this means that they do not have any connections with the forces currently operating in the area. Therefore, there is no way to confirm Markova and Novomarkova being under Russian control unless geolocated footage comes out or a new contact is established. Therefore, if any of my viewers know anything about what's happening there and either have relatives on the front line in the area or locals in the area, whatever, contact me on my Telegram. You can message me directly through the channel and then communicate it to me, and we'll talk about it, discuss it, so I could get some confirmation in the area. But so far, there is no confirmation on my side for these developments. Now, if the Russians have control over Markova and Novomarkova, it is not surprising for them to push through the western flank of Mayske down towards Klinove and Besemyane. This is due to the fact that if we take a look at the fortifications in the area, there are some lines of barbed wire. These lines are located in between Mayske and Vyrolyubivka. But if the Russians are pushing through from the Mayske direction, they'll be able to bypass much of it, cut through some positions along the forest lines, push through these forest lines, reach into the rear of Vyrolyubivka, or push through further north, bypassing the town completely, reaching into Klinove. If the Ukrainians do not have positions beyond the first and second lines of defense, Russians can be able to push through undetected, reach Klinove and Besemyane, gain control over these settlements. Therefore, it is not unreasonable for the Russians to capture them due to the manpower shortages of the Ukrainians. If they're able to pass through undetected, they'll be able to capture them without resistance, similar to what happened north of the Dnipropetrovsk. At the same time, some Russian sources are even claiming the Russians have pushed from the southern flank of Mayske onwards towards Vyrolyubivka to storm the town and gain control over large portions of it. So the area here north of the railway line, west of the canal, from Novomarkova in the northeast, all the way to Popasne, Klinove, and Vyrolyubivka in the west. It is not clear what is happening in this area. There's been no reports on it from any of my sources for months, and therefore the situation is unclear. But what we do know is that there is activity in the area. The Russian Ministry of Defense can be reliable sometimes and unreliable other times, depending on the reliability of the units operating in the area. As for which units operate in this area and how reliable they are, unfortunately, I do not know. What we do know is that the Kharkiv direction, the Russian Ministry of Defense, is completely unreliable. They claim captures that are not really realistic at all. But at the same time, in the Donetsk region, southern parts of it, and the Dnipropetrovsk region, they are extremely reliable. Whenever the Russian Ministry of Defense claim something has been captured, it always is followed up with geolocated footage or corroborating reports of those captures. Therefore, in some areas, it is very reliable. Other areas, it is completely unreliable. The thing about the truth is that it has happened, and therefore it will eventually come out. The question is when we will know. When it comes out, we will report on it. That's going to be all for this update. Thank you all for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content. Thank you all for watching and have a great day.